Hey there everyone, so today I've got a very interesting video on Guy Hocquenghem's essay, We All Can't Die in Bed. And this essay is particularly interesting because Hocquenghem is very well known for being a very radical gender and sexual theorist coming out of the tradition of Deleuze and Guattari. He's concerned with desire and this sort of radical affective expression of oneself through actions, of course, which is very much Deleuze and Guattari's thing. And in this essay, Hocquenghem is basically looking at a sort of pacification of homosexuality that has occurred throughout the 20th century as it has become normalized. And traditionally in our kind of conceptions of, we need to normalize homosexuality. Like it needs to not be something strange or something foreign. People will get used to it and then people will start to accept it. Now, Hocquenghem is going to push back here a little bit and say that perhaps being radical, being unassimilable, being different is something unique about homosexuality and about gender expression in general that should be retained. And if we fail to retain this unassimilability, we will die in a bed that has been made for us, which is the bed of normalization, of pacification, of neutralization. So opening up here, Hocquenghem says he's talking about the death of Pasolini, and Pasolini was an Italian actor, and he was involved in the political scene, and he was openly gay, and he was very popular, and there was this very famous, in Italian culture at least, and I'm not Italian, I had to do some research myself, but an abduction, torturing, and killing of Pasolini. And it's still a little bit up in the air exactly what the details are, but we have good reason to suspect that it was a far-right Italian group aimed at, presumably doing this for some sort of socio-political reason of making a statement about, openly gay celebrities, for example. Now, this obviously shocked the hearts of many Italian people because Pasolini was very charismatic. But Hocquenghem writes, Pasolini's death seems to me neither abominable nor even perhaps regrettable. As far as I'm concerned, I find it rather satisfying. So much less stupid than a highway accident. In a way, I would want it for myself and for all my friends. And clearly he's poking the bear a little bit here, right? He's not necessarily saying that he wants to die, but he is pointing out here something unique of what he says is the intimate, ancient, and very strong bond between the homosexual and his murderer. A bond as traditional as their delinquent prescription in the big cities of the 19th century. So he's isolating this sort of almost implicitly assumed criminality of homosexuals that links them almost archetypically to being murdered. And, the murder of the homosexual still happens today. And of course, it's very tragic. And Hocquenghem is not saying it's not tragic. But what he is saying is there is something very impactful, something very jarring about when Pasolini, for example, is murdered, rather than, some highway accident of, you disappear and no one ever hears from you again, and it just kind of floats away in the news. So Hocquenghem is kind of taking a little bit of a transgressive act here, transgressive position here, and looking at Pasolini as a sign that there's still some radicality left to be lived, that there's still something unassimilable and unique, especially about being in the public eye, that should give one pause to actually be more radical than one thinks one needs to do. And considering this sort of, he calls it a dangerousness which surrounds homosexuality, homosexual blackmail, homosexual murder, kind of within this, he points out that, quote, in the eyes of the courts and the police, there is, in these cases, no difference between victims and murderers. There is but one suspicious milieu, united by mysterious bonds, a freemasonry of crime where the homo and the murderer intersect. Homosexuality is, first of all, and perhaps for a short while will continue to be, a category of criminality. And it's important to note here, and you'll figure this out especially if you've read Deleuze or Guattari, he's not saying that homosexuals are criminal as such. What he is saying is that the way homosexuals are allowed to become normalized into a culture, be visible as something that's acceptable, that won't just immediately get you stoned or something, that it tends to present itself as being confined to, homosexuals are especially criminal or especially negligent or, whatever. It's very Orientalism kind of in nature of isolating this whole category of people that are the other and kind of defining them through all these stereotypes and, media and whatnot. And for example, this plays out in the legal sphere, where in France, the age of consent was 15 years old if you were a heterosexual. If you were a homosexual, the age of consent was 18 years old. So somehow your sexual orientation was linked to, some sort of hidden realm of chaos that needed more time to develop, or, it's the vestiges of a sort of almost race science, but of course it's not with race, of this notion that differences confer upon them some especially medically significant or socially significant factors that need you to be treated more like in an infantile situation, perhaps. So Hocquenghem is pointing out here that in the case of the homosexual and the murder, because homosexuals were presumed to be more likely to be criminal, right? You think of these kind of the Stonewall era of this radical stuff going on, whatever, we have a very romanticized, very pacified view of what that time was like for homosexuals of, they were just, out getting some, when in reality the only some that a lot of them were getting was, bullets to the head or unfair searches or police brutality or whatever it may be. So with this implicit assumption, which is obviously a sort of cultural blinder that goes over the milieu of society, it is presumed that, there's something extra violent or something extra intrinsically transgressive about homosexuals, such that when the murder of a homosexual occurs, there's this sort of blending of categories where it's almost a fate that has been created by society's perceptions of the homosexual. And as such, this creates a milieu which, Hocquenghem says, a homosexual murder is a whole complete unto itself. And this is very reminiscent of Deleuze and Guattari talking about events, where there is something coherent about an event, but at the same time inexhaustible about the event. It somehow is able to be intimated, able to be pointed to, but not completely understood. And it has this consistency, as Deleuze and Guattari call these events. They have a sort of consistency that, think of consistency as in kind of a repetition, but also consistency like a texture thing, like water or ketchup has a consistency, right? Like a sort of tangibility. There's something remotely understandable, especially about these things that are on the fringes of society. But that tangibility without the totalizability is precisely what Hocquenghem is trying to play on here, is that this phenomenon of the homosexual murder, this sort of stereotype, is an event of its own, which makes sense within the cultural logic, but also because it is with regards to the homosexual, which is a sort of on the edges, on the fringes of society, because you have such a minoritarian group and you have something very violent happening, that it sort of breaks apart our categories of, what it means to be heterosexual through this sort of violent catastrophe that occurs. And you'll see this, for example, too, in Guattari's Becoming Woman, which I've done an essay on, of the stuff that's on the fringes of our concepts of identity actually have the most potential and actually signal to the impotence of what we assume to be normal. And in so doing, being radical on those extremes is all the more important. Now, Hocquenghem talks about the decriminalizing of homosexuality. And he says, well, what do we really want? He says that some people say that, we need to fight to normalize homosexuality, to get rid of the themes of transgression and just make it normal, just like heterosexuality. But Hocquenghem kind of pushes back on this, and he's like, well, it's not like heterosexuality. It's different. That's why it's a different thing. And not only that, but he says, are we going to require, as do the respectable homosexual associations, that the police and the courts accept complaints from homosexuals who are mistreated or blackmailed? Will we see gays, exactly like women, demand the condemnation of rapists by the courts and request protection under the law? And this is a very subtle point that he's making here, but he's basically saying, well, the police and the courts still have a lot to do for women. There's still a lot of ways in which certain practices can be normalized, which can cover up the oppression of females, for example, where you can give them a quote-unquote voice, but, this is the whole thing behind the Me Too movement of, well, women have a voice, but yet still there's this massive rape culture that basically goes ignored because, well, it can be. There's this sort of outer edifice of acceptance of we're all equal under the law, but of course that's not actually how things work. So Hocquenghem writes, I think on the contrary, that even in a struggle for liberation, homosexuality's hope still lies in the fact that it is perceived as delinquent. And that's certainly a very provocative point. And one need not completely agree with it, but really this is identifying homosexuality as a site of enunciation, a site of transgression, which only exists precisely because it is laden with all these mysteries, just like the Freemasonry of crime he talks about, of the homo, of, it's this kind of secret, mysterious, like, Hocquenghem is trying to play on that and say, like, obviously homosexuals are people. Like, that's not a question. We're not trying to create some, like, binarism of, like, you have the heterosexual people over here and the homosexual people over here and they're different races or something. No. What he is saying, though, is part of the liberatory possibility of these categories, such as women or homosexuals, is first off that liberation isn't just going to be given to them open-handed. It requires struggle. If one looks at history, you will see that. But also, one must accept the necessity of transgression. He mentions, however, that over time, there's a sort of respectabilization of homosexuality, as he calls it. That a sort of respectable gay gets built up over time that really pacifies the possibility for being gay to really be different. That there's this insistence on, oh, let's all get along and sing Kumbaya, when in actuality, oftentimes that impulse to egalitarianism might actually bypass changes that actually need to be made. And for example, this occurs in discussions of affirmative action, where some will say, oh, let's just flatten the plane right here and let's treat everyone equally under the law. No affirmative action, because that's racism, according to that position. But the other position will say, well, people aren't treated equally under the law because there's all this other precedent, all these other laws, all these other social conditions, all these other material conditions, which mean they are not equal. And just our saying they're equal doesn't make them equal. It just makes us feel like it, and it makes us ignore those voices. And in the same way, Hocquenghem says that, oh, let's imagine a sort of respectabilized homosexual. What would that look like? And he says, well, it's someone who would just avoid crime, avoid transgression. All one needs to do is avoid cruising in the criminal world, to stop cruising the streets, not to cruise at all, or only to pick up serious young men from the same social sphere. Pasolini wouldn't be dead if he had only slept with his actors. So, right, what's going on here is the bed of we can't die in bed is being crafted here. You have to stay in your lane. You have to stay with your people, which is a terribly problematic idea to say something like that. But you have to avoid going out of your lane, and you just have to stay where you need to be in your social sphere, and everything will be fine. And I think Hockenghem's concern is, well, what kind of society do we create if our identities are defined by that radical negation of any potential for transgression? I think for Hocquenghem, building our identities on at least a little bit of transgression, and maybe a little bit more than society is perfectly willing to just go along with, that might allow us to continue to contest what does real equality look like, what does real acceptance look like. As such, Hocquenghem speaks of a neutralization of homosexuality, a homosexual that is integrated into the law and that is basically this idealized, reassuring modern young homosexual with mustache and briefcase, without complexes or affectations, cold and polite in an advertising job or sales position at a large department store, opposed to outlandishness, respectful of power, and a lover of enlightened liberalism and culture. Gone are the sordid and the grandiose, the amusing and the evil. Sadomasochism itself is no longer anything more than a vestiary fashion for the proper queen. So, right, he's saying like, oh, this is what we have in store for us if we just insist that our job as heterosexuals, homosexuals, men, women, is to become passive, is to fit into an identity. What happens at that point is we lose the grandiosity, the amusingness, the comedy, the irony, all these themes that a lot of other postmodern philosophers like to touch on. We lose those possibilities for transgression that allow for change, and we leave the way for really anyone, but in this case homosexuals, to be integrated and become tame, become one of the good gays, so to speak, right? This is like when someone says, "Oh, you're so polite for a black person," like, it's obviously racist, and maybe the person didn't intend it to be like that, but it is, precisely because there are these implicit assumptions of, unruliness of minority groups or criminality of minority groups, and it surprises us when someone fits into these categories, which it's like, of course they're going to fit into these categories of passivity because we've created these categories for passivity. We've created what Hocquenghem calls the legal homosexual. This leads Hocquenghem to speak of a unisex model where homosexuals become reintroduced fully and completely, not into their differences, but into their similarity. So, right, it's just as if sexual orientation is this unitary phenomena, people just kind of tweak it a little bit. No, Hocquenghem is not asking us to tweak, he's asking us to, explode, to, erupt. And in kind of a dystopian sort of vision, he speaks of what this neutralized category of homosexuals looks like. He writes, "The new official gay will not go looking for useless and dangerous adventures in the short circuits between social classes. He will surely go on being a sexual pervert. He'll experiment with fist-fucking or flagellation, but with the cool, good sense of sexological magazines, not in social violence, but in sex techniques. Pasolini was old-fashioned, the prodigious remains of an epoch that is now being left behind." So once again, Hocquenghem is saying, look, a bed is being made for you, and you can't die in it. You can't reduce sexuality to sex techniques, as he calls it, which is to say something rationalized, something coherent, something placid, neutralized, tame. Instead, you have to insist on identity and action as fundamentally being undergirded by transgression. So I hope this has been helpful. This is a very short essay that you can find in Hatred of Capitalism, published by Semiotext, edited by Chris Kraus and Sylvia Lautringer. Check out any of my other lectures that I've done on critical theory, postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, other literature. Become a channel member for $5 a month and join a monthly philosophy private Zoom. That's it, and I'll see you in another lecture.